Hey everyone, I am going to talk about the women who were playing a key role in the Civil War between 1861 and 65. Here is my outline. I am going to introduce the Civil War nurses to you, talk about Louisa May Alcott, Clara Barton, Susie King Taylor, Dorothea Dix, and the Sisters of Charity. Here you can see the picture of 4 women who took part in the Civil War. I am going to talk about them in details later. When we think about wars, we generally associate men with it. Actually, most of the nurses were still male, especially in camps that were considered unsuitable for women. Hospital workers often felt the need to write down their brutal experiences. They wrote letters to distant friends, diaries, or something that they intended to publish afterwards. This is why we have several credible sources about this period. Women at that time did not have specialized medical training, as nursing was not an actual profession. Before that, men were the doctors who went to houses and tried to heal the patients. So, during the Civil War, the nurses were expected to learn as they healed the soldiers. It is interesting that the title nurse often meant white middle and upper class women. Women of lower classes and of color were mostly working as cooks, laundresses, and such. Louisa May Alcott was one of the nurses of the Civil War. You may have heard about her before, as she is the one who wrote the famous novel Little Women. She also wrote a kind of short story called Hospital Sketches. The main character is not Louisa, but the character's experiences are really similar to hers. She went there completely unaware of what she is up to. She had no medical experience. She met several kinds of illnesses in the ward, including pneumonia and typhoid. According to her work, the smells in the ward were terrible. You can imagine the smell of rotting limb, blood, and sweaty soldiers. She had to clean 40 soldiers in just a few minutes. She mentions that a soldier refused her help. Most of them had no limbs. The nurses also had to serve them food and medicine, read to them, write their letters as they had no hands, keep their possessions. She had many heartbreaking experiences, like when a man asked for a glass of water and she left to get it, and when she got back, he was already dead. She was the one who had to tell a soldier, John, who had a mortal wound that did not hurt, that he has only a few days left. She worked from 6 a.m. to midnight, but later she became a night nurse. Interestingly, she only worked in the hospital for 6 weeks, as she contracted typhoid and she became very ill, after which she was treated with mercury. Here you can see 2 pictures. On one of them, you can see Louisa May Alcott and John, the soldier I told you about. On the other picture, you can see a hospital ward which was decorated to make it more calming and cheerful for the soldiers. Clara Barton was the nurse who founded the American Red Cross, and she led it for more than 20 years. She was interested in nursing from quite a young age, but she did not receive professional training. She started to nurse wounded soldiers when the war broke out near her home. She brought them food, clothes, and medicine. She read to them to entertain them. However, she only gained permission to work as a nurse a year later. She helped to collect supplies by placing ads in newspapers. They often ran out of supplies, so they needed to be creative. Barton sometimes used corn husks instead of bandages, for example. She helped to clean the hospitals, cook, and serve the food as well. She helped both Union and Confederate soldiers. She was called the Angel of the Battlefield. Susie King Taylor was an African-American woman. She was born as a slave in Georgia in 1848, but she escaped in 1862. She became the first black teacher to openly educate African Americans in Georgia. Also, she started to serve as a nurse and regimental laundress, and she did this job until the end of the war. In her writing Reminiscence of My Life in Camp, she says that there were serious illnesses, like smallpox, but she was not afraid. She was vaccinated. She was working for the African American troops, so most of the soldiers there were slaves before. Having experience as a teacher, she taught the soldiers to read and write in the camp. During her time as a nurse, she even learned how to shoot with a musket. They did not eat fresh beef, and the vegetables were dried and pressed. They usually got salt beef. Susie met Clara Barton as well. She said that after a time when she saw men torn by war, without limbs, she did not have any feelings. She just went there to help. She could hear the firing of the guns when the men were fighting. Then they returned without limbs. She became the first and only African American woman to publish an account of her experiences in the Civil War. Here you can see a drawing of women being a nurse. Dorothea Dix started to work in the Civil War for the Union Army, and she became the superintendent of army nurses. This means that she was the one who managed them. She was responsible for setting up field hospitals and first aid stations, recruiting nurses, managing supplies, and setting up training programs. She was found to be very rigid. She had extremely high standards of who could become a nurse. Women between the age of 35 and 50 could be nurses, but they had to be plain-looking. They had to wear black or brown. No cosmetics or jewelry was allowed. Sometimes she even fired nurses she did not train or hire. She did not want vulnerable and attractive women in her team, as she wanted to avoid any exploitation by the men. However, she had many fights with men and the United States Sanitary Commission because of her point of view. She was known for treating both Confederate and Union soldiers. This gained her respect. During the time of the war, she appointed more than 50% of the Union Army nurses. She helped women being recognized in medical fields. The Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph was the first native sisterhood established in the U.S. by Elizabeth Ann Bailey Stetton in 1809, but that was long before the Civil War. Their primary tasks were caring about the dying, the poor, and teaching. In the beginning, they were not trusted because they were Catholic, but later they gained trust because they helped everyone. They served the South, the North, and those who did not take part. They did not care if someone was from higher or lower class. They served with ambulances on the battlefields, hospitals, and in towns. They served at various places, and they were often in danger. Armies planned to take them by force because they were needed in different hospitals. Sometimes they simply traveled through battlefields. A sister had to walk through a bridge once, which was packed with dynamite for the Union Army. So their work was not that safe. Sometimes they were peacemakers. They provided a sanctuary for those in need. For example, if someone's home was burned in the war. They had to travel a lot. They had to adapt to the new places and food and culture and people. They were wearing a distinctive 17th century peasant dress and large white coronet on their head, which were like wings, so they were often called battlefield angels.